All right, well, why don't we get started? Okay, well, yeah, hello and welcome to this year's first Columbia University Epidemiology Grand Round seminar. And it's really a pleasure on behalf of our Grand Rounds Committee, the Department of Epidemiology. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Eugene Richardson. A little bit about him. Dr. Richardson received his medical degree from Cornell University, his PhD in anthropology from Stanford, and completed his residency in internal medicine and fellowship in infectious disease and geographic medicine, also at Stanford University. He currently is an assistant professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School and also holds an appointment in medicine at Brigham Women's Hospital. His work weaves and intersects themes of social justice, epidemiology, medicine, and anthropology, and is sort of carefully placed and scrutinized within the context of sort of social political history. Dr. Richardson has previously served as the clinical lead for Partners in Health, Ebola response in Sierra Leone, where he continues to conduct research on the social epidemiology of Ebola as well as COVID-19. More recently, he's been working with Africa CDC in their COVID-19 response. His overall focus is really on sort of biosocial approaches to epidemic disease prevention, containment, and treatment in sub-Saharan Africa. And as a part of this effort, he's the chair of the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice. Not only that, but of course, he is an author of a highly acclaimed and charged book, Epidemic Illusions on the Coloniality of Global Health. Also the title of his talk today, published a few months ago by the MIT Press. Themes that are critically relevant today. And I love this, but as Dr. Cornel West puts it, we badly need it in these catastrophic times. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Richardson. Thank you again very much.
All right, thanks so much. It's an honor to join you today. And I'm planning to talk a little bit about the book I just put out and then some ancillary work on reparations and COVID that has more, I think would be more ripe for discussion for an epi group. So here's one of the figures from the book and made into a GIF, and this is the Harvard Medical School shield. And you know that the original one says Veritas for truth, and pretty much the idea of the book is that when we're talking about inquiry into human behavior, what the social sciences study essentially, that I'm essentially neo-Kantian, and I see a very big difference between the natural sciences that tell us, whatever, 3 quarks makes a proton, or even an epi that, masks prevent infection, or tobacco causes cancer. I'm talking about when you actually have human behavior involved, when you're interpreting social phenomena, that there's always a place for those interpretations to be ideologically constructed. And what I try to show in the book is how much of what we see in global public health, what we think of as sort of objective, neutral epidemiological studies are in fact constructed along ideological ends. And so what might it look like to commit to studies with different ideological presuppositions I will get to. The other part of the book is to really, if that's the case, that there are, many ways to curate social phenomena, curate the facts of social phenomena, many ways to interpret them, then the ones that come down in the top journals and from the top universities, they often form a monopoly on truth, and which, is to me a continuation of sort of colonial logics of not only extraction, but also of dominating the way people perceive phenomena. And I don't get into the different definitions and theories I use to parse that. So I have no financial relationships with commercial entities to disclose. So here's the cover of the book, and the cover starts with, essentially a play on what I just spoke about, that the typical Western construct of Plato's cave is that there is a single cave. There are people that have been chained and they can only see these shadows on the wall, and here is a coronavirus. But that one of their lot escapes and goes up into the outside world in the sun, the social scientist or the philosopher or the epidemiologist, and then they come back and say, look, this is how things are going. They come back and bring objective truths to enlighten their locked fellows. But if you see things the way I do, in that there is, there is more work of interpretation being done. There's ideology built into the way we're curating our results. Then Plato's cave might look more like a warren, where there's no outside. There's just a lot of different there's a lot of different burrows that people can go to agree upon different ways of seeing social phenomena, different ways of parsing them. And this is essentially a pragmatist notion of truth that we get from William James and John Dewey on down. That truth, at least as far as social phenomena are concerned, is something that we come to agree upon. And the truths that we hold usually end up being truths that serve elite interests. And so the idea, in Habermasian fashion, is to create ideal speech situations where people with different interpretations actually have seats at the table. People without the PhDs or without the Harvard backing or without the voice clips in the New York Times, that their interpretations get a seat at the table. And oftentimes you'll see that they're equally valid ways of seeing the world, and ways that may have a focus more on justice than on perpetuating transnational relations of inequality. So just about my position, where I'm coming from. I mean, as a quote unquote anthropologist, my goal is not to go to places and represent what it's like to people's experience of epistemic violence. Rather, I'm using my experience in Partners in Health and Doctors Without Borders and Harvard and the WHO and World Bank and CDC and all these places that I've worked to kind of hold up a mirror to its participant observation, essentially, of how harmers do their harm. And a lot of this is based on the sort of moral presuppositions. And I think a lot of the aid industry and a lot of what goes on in global public health, it comes from the idea that we're morally related to people in the global South as potential saviors, as people to bring aid, as people to bring studies that help with adherence to HIV meds, these kind of things. But I don't think that many people see themselves as morally related to people in the global South as supporters and beneficiaries from a global institutional order that systematizes this oppression. And this is what coloniality is all about, that even after countries in the global South achieved independence after the period of colonialism, we moved into a period of coloniality where ways of dominating the economic sphere and the mental sphere of people in post-colonies continue to exist. So here's the definition. Coloniality can be described as the matrix of power relations that persistently manifest despite a former colony's achievement of nationhood. The framework attempts to capture the racial, political, economic, social, epistemological, linguistic, and gendered hierarchical orders imposed by European colonialism that transcended independence and continue to oppress in accordance with the needs of capital. Ramon Grossfogel has to say, the heterogeneous and multiple global structures that were put in place over 450 years did not evaporate with independence. We continue to live under the same colonial power matrix. With independence, we move from a period of global colonialism to global coloniality. And then Sabelo Ndlovu from South Africa says, despite the celebration of decolonization as a milestone in African history, Africa has not managed to free itself from epistemological colonization, inscribed on the continent and its people by mission and secular schools, schools of medicine and schools of public health, religious denominations, and other institutions that carried Western cultural imperialism. And through the book, I go through different examples. The one I focus on that's published as an article in Medicine, Anthropology, and Theory is how a study by Harvard epidemiologists that came into DRC to kind of explain why that outbreak in 2018-19 was so large, how they actually carried Western cultural imperialism with them. They were not conducting sort of objectively neutral fact-finding. The results they came up with actually supported status quo relations of inequality and really gutted radical interventions. I think, to sum it up really quick, essentially their study published in Lancet Infectious Disease concluded that the outbreak was so big because people were believing in misinformation, and that they didn't believe Ebola was real, and that they didn't believe that or that Ebola was a bioweapon from the US, and that only if they would read the pamphlets or we could get them to trust us with some WhatsApp discussions would the outbreak stop. And that really, that supports a neoliberal notion of what a human agent is, that they have perfect information and perfect agency to make choices. But it really blames the victims of outbreaks for the propagation of them. Instead, if you really talk to the people and you understand that, the idea that Ebola is a US bioweapon is more a part of historical consciousness. It's actually a structured disposition towards eluding depredation that is based on 200 years of, King Leopold cutting off hands when people didn't get enough rubber, and Belgian extraction of gold and ivory and other resources, to the assassination of their first prime minister and Patrice Lumumba by Belgium and the US, to the US installing puppet Cold War dictator Mobutu, who just took a little bit of money in Kinshasa and allowed transnational companies to come pillage the very, very, very rich resources that DRC has. And then that continues into this day. Anglo Gold Ashanti in North Kivu, where I was working with the WHO on Ebola, they get about 93% of the wealth from the gold that's extracted out of the ground, leaving a paltry 7% for the country, which mostly goes to Kinshasa. And we showed in a paper in Sierra Leone that taxes from the diamond theft over the past 90 years, taxes from them alone would have built a health infrastructure that could have stopped Ebola in its tracks. And so, if you look at if you get to structural determinants of outbreaks and see that in people's responses, the interventions become very different. So if it's their ignorance and their attitudes and practices that are the problem, then you give them pamphlets and WhatsApp groups and try to talk to chiefs to be your friend. If you see that it's legacies of colonialism that are actually structuring people's unwillingness to engage with new foreign invaders, essentially, then repair of those legacies is the intervention, essentially reparations. And so I'm chairing the Lancet Commission on Reparations and Redistributive Justice, and we have a section on Congo that is essentially gathers the evidence for reparations claims, and then makes recommendations, such that the U.S. and Belgium owe trillions of dollars to the DRC. Even in WHO meetings, I would go in and they would say, okay, the last village we went to, only 10% of people accepted the vaccine for Ebola. What do you think? And I'd say, let's get $100 million from Belgium and pay people to get the vaccine, but it has to be clear that that $100 million is just the first installment of the trillions that are owed for a larger reparations plan. And of course, I get laughed out of the room. But I'm serious in that, if you see the 1800s as the century of abolition and ending of slavery, and the 2000s, and the 1900s as the century of human rights discourse, development, and aid, that maybe the 2000s are the century of reparations. And I'll get into some of the the work we've done on that in a little bit. And what I'm most interested in, though, is how people's perception continues to be colonized. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, back in the 80s, said that colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationships to the world. And that's what I will argue, that that studies like this Harvard School of Public Health study actually commits symbolic violence by imposing a perception on people in this Ebola outbreak that they have themselves and their ignorance to blame, instead of the perception which they are offering, which is essentially that there are legacies of colonialism to blame that need to be repaired. Because these narratives do take off. So after this paper came out, I saw Ministry of Health people, WHO people saying, okay, wow, it really is this mistrust, this misinformation belief. We have to combat the misinformation, through changing attitudes and knowledge, attitudes and practice, through getting into the WhatsApp groups, instead of saying that no, we have to intervene on the actual risk structure, which would entail reparative justice. Some more terms used in the book: cultural hegemony. So if exploitative socioeconomic relations are indeed foundational to the social order, as they are in the US and as they are in our relations with countries in the global South, then this is likely to have a fundamental shaping effect on social ideation. And so to me, conducting public health research, is a form of, if it's social inquiry, then it's a form of social ideation, and it can't help but be influenced by dominant ideologies. Some of what I critique in the book, I label bourgeois empiricism, and Levitz and Lewontin had to say that. Models of disease causation that obscure socio-historical forces. So this disease causation model or narrative from Harvard School of Public Health is that people have ignorance to blame for disease causation. These are political acts. They give support to social structures that hide behind scientific objectivity to perpetuate dependency, exploitation, racism, elitism, and colonialism. And we're beyond like the sort of Trumpian post-truth, like lies and misinformation. They did collect facts, this group, but they curated them in such a way as to blame the individuals there. I also did a study that curated facts in my discussions with people, but there was an eye towards social and historical justice. And that's my point. I think with a lot of social inquiry, and especially with modeling, there can always be ideological predispositions that you have to be conscious of. And when I said that they committed some symbolic violence, here's the definition: that it can be thought of as the capacity to impose the means for comprehending and adapting to the social world by representing the economic and political world in disguise, taken for granted forms. And here's a paper on Ebola survivors in Sierra Leone, where we use this theory essentially to describe just the symbolic violence the word outbreak commits. So, even though my PhD is in anthropology, I guess I would consider myself more of a critical theorist. And a critical theorist essentially just takes the categories we use and shows that these are not really normal categories. They're not objective. They do work. And so outbreak, the word outbreak essentially implies that there is an amount of suffering from an infectious disease that kind of ends when transmission ends. And this paper was all about the post-Ebola suffering that kind of went on past the end of outbreak, where most of the NGOs left and all of the money that we were promised to rebuild social health systems left as well. I also use some détournement in the book, which is the kind of the artistic movement, neo-Marxist artistic movement in the 60s, that would take advertisements and posters and use the symbols that were kind of familiar to the public and rearrange them to make more, to deliver a different message. And so here, this was the poster in Sierra Leone that basically said, you get the virus, go to the health center. Once they found out that the health centers were amplifying transmission, they said, okay, call this 117, don't go to the health center, and we'll send somebody to you. But to me, this is this is this is put out by UNICEF, and this is the kind of narrative of like what people's understanding of the outbreak. You would be left thinking, okay, there's this entity called Ebola that makes me sick, and then I need to get help for it. Where I would posit, if you use different categories of thought, you could easily say that there is an entity called, legacies of colonialism, or mining companies in Kono district where I work that have taken all the diamonds without paying their taxes. That to me is a real pathology. Underdeveloped health centers that, because of this tax evasion, is a cause of this person's suffering. Here we have the barbaric colonialism, purposeful underdevelopment, epistemic violence. Here's a slide I like to show. Back in 2017, $162 billion came into the continent in the form of AIDS, loan, and remittances, and $200 billion came out in illicit financial flows. This purposeful underdevelopment stuff, like illegal theft of money. So the idea that there's development is a total farce. USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. If the continent is a net creditor to the global north of $40 billion, then this idea of development is a farce. And we can look back as far as Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s, who said that, the first president of Ghana, who said that, aid is really just a revolving door for extraction. You can give a little with one hand to disguise what you're taking with the right. And the thesis in the book is that actually a lot of what constitutes global public health science aids in this occulting of not only resource theft, but inability to combat or repair legacies of colonialism. I also use, the book is quite experimental. Like, I don't think you can critique modernity with using its terms of reference. And so each chapter, and they're not even called chapter, they're called redescriptions in true like pragmatist fashion, is a different heuristic. So there's everything from flash fiction to kind of reverse ethnography, to rewritten Platonic dialogues. And here's one where I do a network modeling exercise, where I just take data from previous studies and look and essentially do a study on Black women at high risk for HIV acquisition in South Africa, where control group incidence is 1% or 8% at a year. Compare that to the dapivirine ring, which showed whatever 20%, 27% efficacy, but showed no efficacy in the younger women, and then showed what it would look like if women were able to just change themselves into being white. And this is part of my critique of regression modeling, causal inference, big data, is that you oftentimes cannot get a variable that sums up, that is a well-defined sum up of all the structural determinants. In this case, I think only race change could do it, and that's why this is it's a critique and not a real study. Essentially, departing from Imperia's irony is, of course, incoherent to imagine people switching their race if race is conceived as an intersubjective construct. However, it can serve as a heuristic device to demonstrate the conservativity inherent in causal inference, because it's the only really well-defined intervention that you could sum up so many structural pathways of harm. And so here I will, I think I mentioned a little later on, one of your colleagues, Sharon Schwartz, her paper on is the well-defined assumption in causal inference conservative. That to me is one of the 5 best papers ever written that I've read across medicine, epidemiology, anthropology. It's fantastic. I think it gets right at the heart of what I'm trying to discuss today. Here I just throw the R code on there because I actually see these models as a form of rhetoric. And so to show people what different forms of rhetoric can look like, here's what the rhetoric to give an ironic network modeling study of a critique of causal inference, this is what it actually looks like in different form. And so, you know, where I think we can all sort of evolve as social scientists is seeing ourselves not as, you know, the scientist whose job it is to set ourselves slightly ahead or slightly to one side in order to find these capital T truths about what's going on in the world, but rather to be more focused on how we are to struggle against these forms of power that we are both objects and instruments of. And I'll give some more examples of that. You know, you don't feel like reading the whole book. 2 of the chapters are exist as articles. This is the afterword, and it's in BMJ Global Health, where I essentially talk about, and this Ariel Rubinstein, who's an economist in Israel, says the same thing about economic models, that, you know, they are merely fables dressed in formal language. That therefore create the illusion of being scientific. And for the most part, for me, they serve not as forecasts, but rather as means for setting epistemic confines to the understanding of why some groups live sicker lives than others, confines that sustain predatory accumulation instead of challenging it. And I'll give some examples, mostly about IHME because it's so easy to critique. So here's a model of a group that I feel committed symbolic violence, not like I haven't, but, you know, I'm cherry picking these examples. This was a group out of Princeton that talked about spatial and temporal dynamics of super spreading events in the 2014 West Africa Ebola epidemic. And they used the word super spreader 38 times in this article. And to me, that is, you know, you could analyze, why does this guy here get called a super spreader? Who determined that this was the kind of active node in a long historical network of, you know, as the agent or the engine for the 5 people that were infected after him? How does he become the agent, the super spreader, the one that this paper says super spreaders drove Ebola epidemic? If we could only find these super spreaders beforehand, we could, you know, we could squash the epidemic in its tracks, you know. And so, yeah, when you critically analyze these categories, you know, is he a super spreader? Is he an Ebola patient? And that's using kind of a methodologically individualist approach. If you use the methodologically relationalist approach, you would actually not see them as either, but more as a personal protective equipment bereft care nexus. But even going further than that, you could see, again, the mining company as a super spreader. So, you know, taking the example in DRC in North Kivu, where 93% of the wealth was taken out of the ground, and if it had remained there, there could surely be enough money for health infrastructure to stop Ebola. How does that company not get called the super spreader? And I think they don't get called the super spreader because it's hard to give them a well-defined role as a super spreader, because we're so focused on how can we see, like, it's easy to see that this guy caused the next infection because the virus jumped from him to the next person. It's harder to see how AngloGold Ashanti caused infections to go on. And that's why I think we have to throw it away when it's that conservative a way of parsing health phenomena. We step back to a more determinative model, where one can clearly see by making these associations that they're, and through counterfactuals, that if there were another couple billion there that hadn't been taken, and that this had been used for health infrastructure, then, you know, they could have been like Nigeria, who was able to contain their outbreak pretty quickly because they actually had a very strong public health infrastructure in place. There's plenty of corruption and all that, but there were mechanisms in place to halt the spread there. So I essentially see epidemiology as a dispositif. I mean, you can see by this definition, which is Agamben's extension of Foucault's. He says that further expanding the already large class of Foucauldian apparatuses, I shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, and secure the gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on how COVID, this isn't in the book because it's newer, but how COVID models have done this. They have the capacity to capture people's imagination, orient them to a future where we may be headed, determine and control behaviors from masking to social distancing to closing down of schools, and securing this discourse through propagation through media and all of that. The book itself goes through critiques of each of these four paradigms. And as I said, this is my favorite article. And if those of you that haven't read it, it's brilliant. There's another critique of big data. And then in the rest of the slides, I'll show some critique of the regression models and epidemic modeling. So let's go after IHME because it's very easy to see how they are essentially transfer mechanisms for neoliberal philosophies. So Institute for Health Metrics, here's a good article in The Nation that just talks about, are Bill Gates' billions distorting public health data. If you give $600 million to an organization and you build their unit like right down the road from your house, you may have an outsized role in determining how we parse health phenomena. Well, let's focus on those IHME forecasts from back in the spring. So first of all, the true number of next day deaths fell outside of their prediction, out of their 95% intervals, 70% of the time. So they were completely wrong. Or, as Nassim Taleb would say, they're not even wrong, and we'll get to him. But their plunging projections were also used by the Trump administration to say that they were doing competent work. So they were easily co-opted for ideological purposes, in this case on the far right. And here's, if you're interested, there was a kind of debate, and many of you probably saw this on the web between Taleb and John Ioannidis. With Ioannidis saying, we just need more data, we just need better data. And Taleb saying early on with these fat-tailed variables, there's so much uncertainty that you're never gonna get to it. So why even waste the energy on going after that uncertainty? You should take the most paranoid path possible, which is what China and Japan and Sierra Leone and South Korea did, and contain the outbreak pretty quickly, instead of doing what Italy did or UK did, where you let it run and it ran. But even more, further than being wrong or ideological, I actually think the work is racist. And this is essentially using Ibram Kendi's definition that racist work or policy or analyses is work that either adds to inequalities between races or continues the status quo. The only work that can be considered anti-racist is that which looks to decrease disparities or reduce inequalities. And so these forecasts, they really just talk about what happens if you wear masks, social distance, close down some schools. There's actually no intervention in risk structure. So even if we go from 3 million cases to 1 million cases because everybody follows this, in both scenarios, 3 times the amount of people of color are dying because there are no risk structure interventions built into it. And so therefore it's doing racist work because it's perpetuating status quo disparities. I think on top of it, they actively delimit through their exaggerated precision and acceptance of government interventions, as opposed to interventions in risk structure, as status quo, the public's ability to imagine social alternatives. And so part of what we were trying to do with some of our ancillary work on the Lancet Commission was to imagine what social alternatives would look like, what anti-racist modeling would look like. And so we published this paper, Reparations for American Descendants of Persons Enslaved in the US and Their Potential Impact on SARS-CoV-2 Commission. And it just came out, you can see, like a month ago. And here's the definition of racism that I was talking about. So race is a power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially. racist policy or analysis is any measure that produces or sustains. And I think that's the important thing. I think these models sustain racial inequity because they don't allow the imaginary to even imagine either interventions into racial justice or in the risk structure. An anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity. So the background of the paper: in the US, Black Americans are suffering significantly disproportionate incidents of COVID-19. So going beyond epidemiological tallying, the potential for racial justice interventions, including reparation payments to ameliorate these disparities, hasn't been adequately explored. And models, here's the point: models must make assumptions about how people interact with others, but they rarely account for social forces like institutional and cultural racism that structure such impressions. It's hard to enumerate these variables. Therefore, they can obfuscate such forces in their attempts to describe outbreak transmission dynamics. Just a quick word on our definition from our Lancet report on what reparations are: knowledge of a grievous injustice, redress for the injustice, and closure of the grievances held by the group subjected to that injustice. And our report has about 10 different cases from around the world, and each of them is headed by somebody that would essentially benefit from those reparations, a scholar that works in that area. In this one, we just focused on reparations for Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the US. And the way we did it was by considering a range of reproductive ratios, essentially by we compared Louisiana to South Korea, saying that Louisiana is sort of an archetypal segregated society that has a high proportion of people of color, at least Black people, but not Hispanics or Asians or Native Americans, so that we were able to do sort of a binary analysis, plus they had some good COVID data. And then we compared that to South Korea, which we thought of as more an egalitarian society that does not have people that are descendants of former enslaved people. And then we basically modeled what the effect of monetary reparations would have on the actual descendants, but also on R0 as a whole, like as on group transmission dynamics. And we just used next generation matrices. We kind of plugged in what we got as the higher R0 for, we did some Walinga Tunis and found that, the R0 at the beginning of the Louisiana outbreak was kind of in the 4s. And that's based on the fact that, R0 is not a intrinsic quality of a pathogen. It actually builds in social structure into it. And so the social structure in Louisiana is one such that this variable here, the transmission rate between Black people, is quite high compared to the rest of these. And because the diagonal of the Seigen structure can dominate the value of R0, having a high risk group really can shoot this number up. And so essentially what we did was back calculate these transmission rates using our kind of predetermined ideas of what R0 might be, with the assumption that this was going to be much greater than this, which was than the white to white, which was going to be much greater than this, which is just a little bit greater than this. So we had an order of what we thought the transmission rates would be highest, because the transmission rate is made from a contact rate and transmissibility. So a lot of this is based just on the contact rate that, just through census data, we're able to show that Black people in Louisiana live in much more overcrowded housing, meaning over one person per room. And so reasoning through the consequences of increased equity via matrix transmission models, we demonstrated how the benefits of a social reparations, a successful reparations program, could have reflected in this ratio, which I'll show you in the next slide, could have reduced R0 for the general population by 30 to 60%. And so we conclude that a restitutive program targeted towards Black individuals not only decrease COVID risk for recipients of this redistribution, but the mitigating effects would be distributed across racial groups, benefiting the population at large. Here's what I talked about when we did our initial findings of, what was R0 for Louisiana compared to a more egalitarian place, and reasoned that the inegalitarian social structure is built into the initial R0 because this is before, right, any interventions take place. And what we found that is, assuming that, with contact rates being very high, that the ratio of transmission among Black people compared to whites is 4 to 5 times higher. This gives you that R naught in the range of 4. And that by reducing, and so the idea is kind of just sort of simple, it's like a thought experiment, that if you were able to reduce people's risk structure to near parity, it's like where this gets to 1, or even above 1, say it's 1.5 because it's hard to get rid of some of the legacies, then you get down to an R naught for the general population of just above 2. And I'll add, I forgot to say in the methods, that this is a reparations program that has been promoted by the Duke economist Sandy Darity and has a huge following, that reparations in the US should take the form of eradicating the wealth gap between Black and white people. And that wealth gap is currently $10 trillion, which actually amounts to $200,000 per 40 million, 10 million. So $250,000, I guess, per 40 million descendants of people enslaved in the US. What would be the mechanisms by which this could work? It would narrow the path-dependent racial wealth divide, so essentially repairing all of the historical social structure that led to this wealth divide. To changes in the built environment, so that people aren't overcrowding and that they actually have the ability to social distance. Frontline would actually be spread across racial groups, so B to B would not be as high, and then decreased race-based allostatic load. If you believe that there is that some of the mortality we're seeing is due to an amount of allostatic load on patients that have experienced racism, then then this is potentially one of the mechanisms. Although I think, in looking at more recent data, and this was our hypothesis back, we started writing this back in April and May, and it got denied at many places. And it didn't get denied because of the models. They always came back and said, the models are great. It's such a huge assumption to think that $10 trillion would achieve equity. Or, I mean, to us, it was kind of racism built into peer review, that, again, we can't imagine beyond incremental interventions to do our counterfactuals. And so we conclude that since reparations had not been enacted, though, reopening of American society, we predicted would have a disproportionate adverse mortality effect, but we didn't get published until after that happened. So this effect was predictable. And so it's kind of, you want to be radical, you can say it's Tuskegee in a way. We knew that there were disparities, and we didn't do any racial, risk structure interventions, and we opened up early without any of these interventions. And so lastly, the appalling evidence of racism embodied as disproportionate COVID incidents should add to moral, historical, and legal arguments for reparations for descendants of people enslaved. Now, this actually made it into CNN. The paper got an altmetric of like 500 right now. I have received huge amounts of hate mail, enormous amounts, and totally racist hate speech. It's rather disturbing. No threats on my life, but disturbing racist hate speech. And it's still coming in. So that's that part. One more critique just on meta-regressions that done by the IHME. It's essentially comes to how you choose your variables. I think in the study or in the book, I give a quick example of how you take this one study out of Stanford that showed that USAID money was good, floats all boats, it reduces under 5 mortality in recipient countries that receive it. All you had to do was add another variable for illicit financial flows to show that those gains are offset in countries where there are huge amounts of illicit financial flows. And so it's a very political choice picking your variables, and you can come up with very different answers and support very different ideological purposes. So the Stanford study supports USA continuing to be sort of this handmaiden of post-colonial extraction, and the guys that wrote it are known for being neoliberal. They're the ones who did this same COVID studies that essentially partnered with the guy from JetBlue, took money to really show that we shouldn't be closing down American society. So it's, for me, it's very easy to see, and I guess because I'm trained in it, like ideology built into studies, especially like the Stanford stuff that makes it so easy. Here, in these global burden of disease studies, I think the problem is just the choice of downstream variables. You know, really, if you can say that in this study, the top 3 causes of death, you know, so the top 3 causes of people suffering around the world are whatever, it's like alcohol, tobacco, and hypertension, you know, really guts the upstream determinants of why people live sicker lives in the global south. You know, even say Ebola, who's the chief editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health, tweeted, you know, is it even ethical to publish these global burden of disease studies? Because it really imposes this downstream understanding of global health suffering. And in so doing, perpetuates these, you know, technical Gates interventions instead of moving it back upstream, which would, you know, get us to much more reparative interventions. And so if IHME's mission is to improve the health of world population by providing the best information on population health, to me, that's somewhat like saying if they existed back in the, you know, 17th and 19th centuries and they went around plantations and they said, okay, counted up how many people died from strokes, heart attacks, and malnutrition on plantations, and then wrote those numbers like we're giving the best information on, you know, mortality, why these people died. There's no analysis of power. With that analysis of power, you perpetuate status quo inequalities. And so I basically conclude that we can trace human rights failings to some of the impoverished discursive infrastructure of objectivist epidemiology. And if we change these things, we actually transform global health by just transforming how we represent it, how we impose understandings of health phenomena on people that aren't part of the academy or don't have the research apparatus to be, you know, dominating the narratives. So with that, I will say thank you. If there's any questions that come up or want any more discussion afterwards, please feel free to email me, but it would be great to open up for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. For folks who want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat box, and you know, we can certainly unmute so you can ask them live.
Hi, Barun. There's a question in the chat from Ava Kam.
Oh, I'm not seeing the chat. Gerald, can you unmute?
Ava, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Charlie's saying that we can't unmute.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a current EPI student, and before Mailman, I was in the humanities. And I think sometimes I struggle a bit with the focus on quantification of things like race and oppression, which I think can be very challenging to quantify. And then we kind of output quantitative methods and like models that can, I think, take on a language of power and potentially be oppressive themselves. And I was wondering if epidemiology can sometimes be like inherently conservative in its methods. Would these questions be better answered by other qualitative methods, for instance? And then like, what would you think the place of epidemiology is then in answering these questions about colonization and oppression?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And I saw in the chat that, so Sharon is in Lillian. So hi, Sharon. I'm a huge fan. You know, as I said, I love that paper. So I guess people, someone read the book and told me, oh, you know, you're just another one of those anthropologists that like wants to just, you know, bring qualitative research on top. It's like, no, that is not it. Like, look at my warrant. The way I see things is that the quantitative approach is its own burrow. Qualitative approach is its own burrow, but also the people in Congo saying Ebola is a bioweapon is its own burrow, because they are all ways of parsing phenomena that should vie for the forefront of our consciousness, you know, to explain what's going on. In fact, I have a paper that should be coming out, I don't know, sometime soon. It's called Story Technologies. And we actually look at this Ebola outbreak in Bumpe that was first described by the CDC, the US CDC, and they just did like, you know, people that reported to the ETU. These were the sick people. Here's their connections. Here's who they infected. I don't know if you've ever been to the CDC museum. They even have like a whiteboard in the museum that shows like one outbreak in one of the Freetown wharfs, how they connected everybody. I mean, those are completely wrong. Like we've gone back in with serosurveys and shown that, first of all, like 25% of people have asymptomatic infections, so we include those. And then a bunch of people didn't even go to care because they didn't want to, you know, they were afraid. So you have these, you know, narratives that look like an objective picture of what the outbreak is, and then you just come in later with a serosurvey and show it's completely wrong. And for me, I wouldn't even say mine is right because so many people have moved, and it's hard a year later to get like what the actual connections were. But then you have the anthropologists come in and describe that it was much more of a you know, an outbreak of, you know, misinformation or something like that, and people, right? That's another description of it. Then you have the people's description of it. And to me, these are all kind of forms of story technologies. Like I see the modeling, I see the qualitative stuff, I see that this is a US bioweapon. And to me, that's just a critique of globalization. These are all forms of rhetoric, and there are different ways of getting at describing the situation, but they're also different ways. They also have a lot of ideological baggage with them. So again, you know, ones that see people as rational agents, you know, really gut structural understandings. And those that have a little more structural understandings actually allow for, you know, more radical interventions. And I think the problem is that, you know, this was done with economics. When you can quantify things, it's a lot easier to, you're more rhetorically convincing. You're not anyone closer to truth, just more rhetorically convincing. And when you get more grants because you're more rhetorically convincing, then you start to achieve what I was talking about. This is cultural hegemony. I think Sharon said this in her paper that, you know, causal inference and big data have come to achieve cultural hegemony as methodologies in epidemiology, and it's because like so much can be, to me, I think it's just because they're so rhetorically convincing, just stylistically, not really with their descriptions. I actually think Ebola as a bioweapon is a much more poignant description of the outbreak, of like what caused it to be, you know, because it's a critique of legacies of colonialism, what caused it to be so explosive, than just these ones that come in and say people believe in misinformation. So I think it has to go beyond just like putting qualitative on top, but really this is the pluriversal approach, polycentric approach, really seeing that all ways of interpretation have a seat at the table. And the problem with this is the huge problem, which Steve Fuller has talked about. Then you get the Trumpians, right? They have to have a seat at the table for their misinformation. And because this is what democratization of knowledge production looks like. And the only way you beat them is not because, I mean, you can show that they're not dealing in facts and we're dealing more in like curation of facts. But it also has to do a lot with this pragmatist notion of truth. Like, what are we going to come to agree on as a group? And that group is coming to agree on these things because I think, you know, they see downward mobility. And they see their promised white privilege evaporating. And so the only way, you know, a structural person, the only way you're going to fix that is, I found this out through publishing this article and getting all the hate mail. It's not going to be through publishing these articles. I think there has to be, this is why I'm really focusing on reparations. There has to be enforced repair of huge inequalities. And when you get to more egalitarian stuff, I think you start to see less of the conspiracy stuff. So that was sort of whirlwind about response.
How do we work to challenge power structures that uphold inequality when we are part of it?
So sorry, you said, how do we work to challenge?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted. Dr. Richardson, we have another question from Adam Whalen. Adam, I'm going to unmute you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you again for an amazing talk. I'm just curious, you know, we talk a lot about structural issues and that in order to solve some of these inequalities, you have to think structurally. But you know, obviously like you're giving a talk at Columbia, like you are a professor at Harvard, like we are members of entrenched power systems purely by being a part of these institutions. And so I'm wondering how we work to sort of upend those power structures when we are explicitly parts of them, and whether you think that lends more legitimacy to our work, trying to work from the inside to change it, or if you think that actually weakens our effort as opposed to like trying to be an activist from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem for me, right? Like that I've gotten this question before, right? Because I'm just representing privilege at an elite institution. And I think the ways I've dealt with it are, one, to use my sort of powers of observation, not to impose findings on people that aren't part of my privileged class, but to actually examine my own class and how it's committing harm. So this was a description of how I think our privileged places can commit harm. I think the other way is to really, you know, to ally with the movements and colleagues in the global South. So for instance, like right now, I was seconded to the Africa CDC this year, and I'm doing these sero surveys because that's what they asked me to do. I've even been yelled at by some people, like, why do these sero surveys? You're just perpetuating how long it takes us to figure out that lockdowns are going to kill way many more people on the continent than the virus itself. Why don't you just switch all your weight to people that are trying to get this message out? And it's like, well, those aren't my allies. Those aren't the people on the continent that I'm working with. The other thing is, like with the Lancet Commission, you know, even though I'm a convener for it, every one of the sections is written by somebody who would be receiving, you know, and is led by somebody who would be receiving those. So, you know, Madhu Pai talks about leaning back, and I guess, you know, that's sort of that. But to me, it's a huge deal. Like, am I able to from Harvard? You know, you could see in this book, it's got lots of critical theory jargon, even though I want it to be more publicly accessible, but I have an eye towards tenure track, and, you know, your first book and the tenure track is supposed to be more academic, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm trying to raise money to create a program at Harvard that continues the work of the reparations work and gets into more like ecologic justice and whatnot. But just yesterday I see my friend Cornel West. He's doing exactly what you're talking about, what we should be doing, and gets his fourth tenure denied. To me, that was one of the most deflating things I've come across in my career. And I even said to myself, why would I even continue here then if my role model got, you know, sidelined? So I don't have the best answer to that. This is kind of what I'm, you know, up to now, but I may find that the co-optation is too much if I stay in the academy.
We have another question from Dr. Ezra Miller. Ezra, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. That's a great talk, and I've been thinking along the same lines, including taking off from some of Sharon's work, which in the early days we did together, but she's gone much further. And but I'm struggling with this question of, okay, if you accepting that, can epidemiology, how would you use epidemiology to address questions about structural change? It's difficult. I find it difficult to I could ask the question, but I find it difficult, you know, to say, what do you do then?
Right. Yeah, and I guess, you know, my job, going back to our Socratic dialogues, like my job is, as Gadfly, is to just spark the interest. You are the experts. I'm no expert in modeling or epidemiology, so I would trust that, you know, once you know, you get the spark about going down this direction, you would you'd be able to come up with potential novel methods and whatnot. I mean, we tried to do that in that reparations paper, and I think we used a novel sort of, you know, just using next generation matrices to kind of show this idea. But I like the, who is it? Nathan Nunn. He's an economist, but he's been doing some of this where one of his papers shows how, and I don't totally buy it, but I think one of them is about how current contemporary distrust in West Africa, he somehow found a way to trace it to, 400 years ago, humans getting stolen for the slave trade. Some of his students put out another paper about the Congo Brazzaville, that when it was a French colony, all the sleeping sickness campaigns where they rounded people up and they, did the lumbar punctures and they gave them medicines which put them blind. You can trace where those were using colonial records. And then if you look at the country now, people in those areas are less likely to participate in clinical care or get their blood drawn. So you can see, using historical data from 90 years ago, they're able to trace what could have been called, mistrust or misinformation or disbelief or ignorance, actually tracing it to historical forces that, i.e., colonial medicine. So I think people are finding ways to parameterize social forces, historical forces, but I think you have to get away from the causal mechanisms, because you're never going to show that those things caused it. Even though Nathan Nunn does claim causal inference, I don't know how he gets away with it. But I think if you dethrone this causal inference and get back to a more determinative, associative approach, then you can push out studies that are more about historical determination than very downstream causation.
What just a very quick follow-up.
Sure.
What about if there were, for example, a natural experiment where there was actually a structural change? I mean, there have been revolutions that have been redistributed, there have been such things.
Yeah.
Or would you consider that still under the, under the rubric of, I guess, perpetuating?
Oh, I like that. In fact, I went to Jamie Robbins, who does the causal inference stuff, and I said to him, all right, we're talking about in our South Africa section of reparations, land reform. So they're talking about, you've heard it in the news, South Africa may do the same thing that Zimbabwe did, where, take the land back from the white people that had stolen it and then redistribute it to Black citizens. And hopefully they do it better than Zimbabwe did. But I talked to Jamie, I was like, all right, help me set up this natural experiment where we're going to see, like, if everybody gets their land redistributed, what HIV outcomes look like 10 years down the road from the people that got land redistributed to them, because that's a huge structural intervention. In the book, I critique, I basically picked the first HIV paper on causal inference that had to do with South Africa, because that's sort of where I had, precursor knowledge. And it was another Harvard study that basically pseudo-randomized people at when they got when they went to essentially getting their ARVs. So people right around the 200 mark, some went and some didn't get ARVs, and that they were able to causally state that people that start on ARVs decrease food security in the house that they live in. Maybe because they're getting better and they're eating up more food, or because they're traveling more to the clinic because the ARVs were free. And I basically critique this as, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Here you have brilliant modelers, they have lots of money, they have lots of grants, and they're using a tool that basically dictates the question. Who cares that, we've already shown this in the 80s in Partners in Health, that, you give a food basket to people on TB treatment and they do better. Why do I need, someone who has the new causal inference mechanism or methodology to tell us that same thing when you're just wasting your talent? And to me, that's the problem, right? When a method comes to dominate, it can dictate the questions you ask. It can, and really what it's doing is gutting more informative, more justice-based analyses. I like this one. Anybody can run with it when they do this land reform. And it'll take a long time, but I totally believe in natural experiments to make these structural arguments, because you're never going to set up the randomized trials for that.
Thanks.
Okay, we have another question from Agu Fayemwa.
Hello, Dr. Richardson. Thank you for your presentation. It was super informative. I have a question that's kind of similar to Adam's question. I'm interested in hearing your views, whether idealistic or practical, of how do we and the major stakeholders and players in global health kind of change our operations to, you know, reflect the new landscape that does decolonize how we go about global health work. I know you had mentioned experience with MSF. I interned with MSF over the summer at a time where it really looked like they were soul searching and seeing like, how do we change this organization? You had mentioned, you had critiqued IHME. I remember I worked on a different project that's relied heavily on IHME estimates. So how do you, I guess, how would you see us, you know, changing the way we do stuff to really reflect a different, you know, way of thinking in the global health space?
So, yeah, that one, it is hard. I think what I talk about in the conclusion is essentially, you know, and we'll continue to focus on epi that's used to understand social phenomena and human behavior. Like, we'll leave I'm not going to critique masks, you know, prevent infection. I'm not going to critique tobacco causes cancer. We still need that work done, but that's kind of physiologic. It's outside the realm of human behavior. When we get into the human behavior stuff, where which is essentially interpreting social phenomena, that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what social scientists do. Then I think the most important thing you can do is realize that you're not doing objective, neutral work, even though you may have been programmed to, especially with you know, the big data and causal inference paradigms. I mean, to me, causal inference is a scientific paradigm, and that's probably why it's achieving this cultural hegemony. But it does such narrow work that it only has to be like a small tool, and not the big tool that everybody's running around to use. So my my recommendation, which is kind of the critical theory recommendation across the board, is that you're always reflexive about the work you're doing, and really understand what are the ideological foundations that you're bringing to the work. You know, are the results, if you're using IHME stuff and blaming human suffering on, like, again, on very downstream variables, you know, are you perpetuating an understanding of the world that where aid and technocrats from the World Bank and the WHO and, you know, NGO interventions are the solution, or are you, you know, does your research highlight where more reparative forms of justice that go beyond the kind of anti-politics machines that are the WHO and Doctors Without Borders and whatnot. So it's really like taking a foundational look at what you're producing, and what, you know, Foucault's famous quote is, well, one of the many, is people know what they do. Okay, so yeah, everyone here is our expert public health specialists. They know why they do what they do. You know, they do it because they want people to have better health, better lives. But what they often don't know is what they do does. So when you finish your work and put it out in the world, what kind of ideological purposes does it serve? And to me, it's not a coincidence that the arch capitalist in our country, who was a monopolist when he was running Microsoft, is the funder of an organization that chooses to parse health data in a way that continues to promote very, like, rational choice, neoliberal understandings of the world. Anything, you know, if they started doing studies on how, you know, reparations that were paid for by 20% tax on billionaires, you know, if they started producing those studies, that, you know, you can be sure that funding would go away. In fact, Gates's new insult for people is calling them a communist. It's not even new. You know, that's how he insults people that come up with these things. So, so seeing how the ideological plays a role in your work. And then again, right, allying, trying to, I mean, every school that I've presented, not like a book talk, but at like a decolonizing conference, every single one has been organized by students. So it's kind of more of this youth trying to shake up stuff, because, you know, I think most people realize in our faculty positions that you're going to end up like Cornell West if you tried to do this stuff on, you know, you get your committee would vote you to get tenure, and then the chancellor would say no because, you know, you've engaged in work that undermines. I mean, I could line up 20 projects right now that show how Harvard colludes in coloniality. And will I do it? I guess probably. Will you see me getting tenure then? Certainly not. So yeah, it's risk taking, and it's you know, speaking back to power, and allying. You know, like if there are people on here we agree on these things, we should be working together more. Because that's the other thing too, right? You guys are epidemiologists, but if you're interested in this stuff, I guarantee you, hardly any anthropologists, socialists, sociologists have read, say, Sharon's paper when it's the best, because the way that disciplines work in the U.S., there's so much boundary maintenance. We're not going to each other's conferences and whatnot. And so I talk about this at the end of the book, like how do we get to kind of a supra-disciplinary social inquiry that has, that curates our data in a way with an eye towards justice.
We have a question from Dr. Brenes.
Thank you. I tried to unmute and then remuted. So Dr. Richardson, you should do it. And it seems like you're already doing it and speaking voice on a lot of these things. And so I want to thank you for your excellent comments and the courageous work that you're doing, especially with the Lancet Commission. So my question is, and it builds on the other questions, I think, so forgive me for a bit of repetition, but you said early on that you had this focus that you wanted to hold a mirror to how harmers do their harm. And I guess that follows along the gadfly description you had of yourself. But I was thinking, if we put up like a positive deviance twist on this, I was wondering if you could comment on how you would or already have focused instead on how, for lack of a better explanation, how healers do their healing. And with that in mind, I'm reminded, you know, the late John Lewis used to introduce a reparations bill each cycle in Congress for slavery. And the US did pay reparations for Japanese internment. And of course, Germany did after the Second World War. And I know there are current reparations bill in the absence of John Lewis that are being discussed right now. How can these, you know, get brought to the fore in terms of healing? And what can we do perhaps as a scientific, or maybe even more specifically as an epidemiologic community to work on that? Thanks.
Right, so yeah, I mean, so actually it's funny when you were saying that, I wrote down John Lewis because, you know, he talks about good trouble, or, you know, positive deviance. And actually the HR 40 was introduced by John Conyers, who recently passed away also. And it's been sitting there, right, gathering dust and never getting passed. There is a lot of, I have a friend on the Hill who did one of those, what do you call it, JW, Johnson, I think it's a Johnson & Johnson fellowship there. And she said that it's starting to get traction. You know, they had Ta-Nehisi Coates speak in a Senate hearing that maybe HR 40 will get considered this year. The people that are, though, running the case section on our committee think HR 40 needs to be fixed, though, because it doesn't quite get at a lot of their concerns. So, I mean, that is one way, right? Getting it into the political realm, or if it's already there, you know, getting it actually considered. You know, one thing that's interesting is that a couple states and cities have passed reparations bills. So some, North Carolina did one, Chicago's done one, California's done one. Some of them are just to actually study what reparations might look like, but it's a start. But our section actually is a bit wary of those, because they actually think it's dividing and conquering. And even if you get a little bit of scraps here and there, that might be enough for powers that be to say, like, look, there's already a couple of reparations movements going on. They want all of it to just combine into the big federal one, which would be the claim against the US government for, you know, upwards of $10 trillion. And so, yeah, I think getting into the political realm, and that was going to be the idea of this program that I'm trying to raise some money for here, that it would, you know, I guess hundreds of people have probably tried this before, like, right, bridging the gap between ivory tower and you know, policy groups, you know, getting, the idea was to bring in a scholar in residence and an advocate in residence at Harvard. So like somebody that's actually doing the grassroots mobilizing. Our reparations conference that we are planning after the report is out is meant to have lots of kind of the grassroots NGOs and advocacy groups, so we can get all the synergy there. But you're right, it's difficult. Like I still wonder how much I'm being co-opted by just staying here. Or, you know, a good critique, which I'm totally willing to accept, is that, you know, I may have written a book that's total irony and a satirical approach, but like that's not substantive engagement. That's just like for people to kind of you know, think about instead of getting in the streets and doing about. So I think there's still something to be said about like finding ways to transcend these disciplinary barriers, not just within the academy, but then with like allies in the grassroots groups. And, you know, each of the places has kind of political movements around, like we have the one around HR 40. It's true, we've had examples of reparations being paid, like to the Japanese intern during World War II, but this was very paltry. I mean, we're talking $10 trillion compared to whatever that was, like 10, 20 million, or within the tens of millions. So it's going to be a much more protracted battle. You know, there's a successful, some people say successful example of Germany paying reparations to Israel in the order of 70, 80 billion dollars, and people showing how that was tied to improving infrastructure in Israel and was actually used for good purposes. But then you also have people say, but then it was also used to like colonize another group. And so is that actually a good example of reparations? So it's very fraught, and when it gets into the political realm, as I'm seeing with all this hate mail, you know, the culture war component of it is to me like the part where I say, like, you know, what do you do about that? I mentioned before that some kind of, this is why I see reparations as instead of dialogue as more important, because it's sort of forced equality. But it's amazing that much of the hate mail said things like, why are you trying to divide our country by, you know, like forcing us to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. When, you know, the way I would see it is that the country was divided from the beginning, and we're trying to find some equality there. And to flip it on its head, it's like there's no way of logically engaging. So I know that wasn't the best answer, but.
Okay, we have a question from Esther Spindler. Esther, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks for the presentation. So this talk just gave me, just reminded me a little bit about the sort of big push of development in terms of the sort of Jeff Sachs approach, just pumping a lot of money, you know, to the millennial development villages, and you know, the sort of social reengineering approach to that. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of distinguishing, you know, reparations from that big push approach, and is it, you know, in terms of just like giving money directly community members, community leaders, or government stakeholders? And then the second part of the question is, how do we sort of avoid the pitfalls, right, that came with the big push of development in terms of pumping in so much money that was then, sort of mandated and directed by donor agencies rather than, people themselves? I hope that makes sense.
No, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it really does, and it's the same question people bring up when they critique reparations, like what is putting the $200,000 check in people's hands going to do? Like what if they're just going to pay off their debts or do this and that and the other? Like if there's not actual structure and policy in place, it could really just go to, just support neoliberal models where, people pay off their credit and then go into deeper debt and whatnot. I don't know enough about the Millennium Development Villages, only then through in my global health experience to hear that it seems the consensus was that they failed more than is even admitted on paper. And I would question, well, then, was it because there was too much of an imposition of kind of Western technocratic, use of that money, or was a lot of it just cash transfer and, run with it? So I think, that, we have to parse that out. But if it was a lot of cash transfer stuff, then, why did they fail? Like in this, those would be important lessons. I think there's something qualitatively different too than just like, this Millennium Development Group just coming in and sort of setting up this altered universe where I'm assuming they're dictating a lot of the measures, and instead working on repairing something that has caused suffering for, when the focus is on that, when the people because it's not just the money that, these groups will say, it's the apologies, it's the changing of the statues, it's the feeling in the bodies that legacies have been repaired. So maybe there's something qualitative about the actual focus on this delivery. Maybe if they had done, Millennium Villages somewhere as like a form of reparations in Kenya, and it was paid by UK or something like that, maybe we'll come out with qualitatively different outcomes, because it's really like structuring people's, kind of ownership and closure of historical forces, because the closure thing is huge, and I guess you're certainly not getting that with with just like an MDV outroll. But yeah, it's a great question. Like, what can be learned from them?
So we're almost out of time, and I wanted to ask a really quick question, Dr. Richardson. Is there something that we sort of in our academic community should be including in our curriculum? Like, are we missing something? Like, how are we informing? I mean, these are great insights and sort of a really sort of valuable lens to see a lot of the work that we do ourselves, certainly abroad, and as well as within country. But just as training sort of the next generation of epidemiologists, is there something else we should be adding on?
Yeah. So, and a lot of this comes from the students. So the students at Harvard, they started their Decolonizing Global Health conference like 3 years ago, partly because of this, because, they said they could go through a whole PhD and not heard the word colonialism once. And so the idea was not just to kind of decolonize the work, but even the curricula. And so I've been asked to teach a like January term course on coloniality and reparations and global health. And I think I'll start that next year. So introducing courses. So Duke introduced a Decolonizing Global Health course, and what Kersley Stewart did there was the students that also had a Decolonizing Global Health and invited some of us to come speak. She's just invited them to come then, give lectures there. So I think at least creating one course where there can be this space to really explore these issues. But then the students have done well on their own, creating like the group itself, where there is a space to kind of feel safe about challenging what they see as, you know, institutions that have a lot of white supremacy built into them, clearly do. And you can see with Cornel West how much of it, it's not just his rabble rousing, there's a huge racism component. Many of us are convinced. So, you know, to allow student groups to find safe spaces to debate these things and to, you know, propose their own interventions. And then I think as far as your work, yeah, you know, learning from Sharon that some of the stuff can be conservative. And so how are you going to do work that is a little more radical, like figuring out what some of your ideological implicit biases might be, allying with people that are trying to do the work to you know, to radicalize, but sort of bust this inherent conservativity. But I get it, it's really hard. Like, you're not gonna get grants if you come over to, like, I get my grants for doing serosurveys, right? I'll never get a grant for doing any of this stuff. And it's like, I don't even really want to do serosurveys. Like, I'd rather focus on this stuff, but I'm also caught in it, like, well, how am I gonna pay my, you know, 60% that I have to pay? And so hopefully there'll be more space for it as we go forward, more grant opportunities, but it's hard. And it gets you labeled, you know, quickly as the, you know, anti-establishment or anti-institution, or me, like, even being anti-science. Like, I try, it's like, I'm not anti-science, but it's hard to walk the line between the two, right? To use it for its good, but also to see where the baggage is.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're at 1 o'clock, and yeah, no, thank you so much, Dr. Richardson, for a wonderful and very sort of insightful seminar. And thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It was great discussion. Feel free to email me if you want to continue the discussion, or follow each other on Twitter if you want to discuss there. But much appreciated, and hopefully we all cross paths sometime soon when the pandemic dies down.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Stay safe. Cheers.